Welcome back to Alyssa's Movie Takes. Today is part two, and the first part was about sex in the Bible when it's a good thing, when it's listed as a good thing. Now we see that in Adam and Eve before the fall, in the Song of Solomon, and in The Chosen, we get it with Simon and Eden. But today I want to look at what happens when sex goes wrong. And there are a lot more stories, unfortunately, in the Bible of how this looks, both when somebody is impacted because they are a victim of a crime or when they are sinning in the way that they are treating sex or thinking that they can get around God's plan for this. In The Chosen, at the end, I'm going to talk about Mary Magdalene and what we saw with her at the beginning of how she was a victim and how that affected her. And also Fatima, the woman at the well, and how she might be more in the perpetrator line, right? She looks a little bit more like a man eater, and yet Jesus still meets them both. So we'll talk a little bit about what redemption looks like at the end of this video. But let's dive in with what it looks like when, well, we'll start with the sin, right? When you mess up sexually in the Bible. Now, early on, actually, one of the patriarchs messes up pretty big, and that's Abraham. Jacob also messes up. Isaac is the only one of the patriarchs, the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who doesn't mess up too bad sexually. But Abraham thinks he is old and his wife is old, and he starts to listen to his wife's advice that instead of her bearing a child, that there would be basically a surrogate. He would sleep with her servant, Hagar, and get her pregnant, and then the line would continue through Hagar. However, that was not God's plan. Abraham didn't seek the Lord about it. He just went in to do it. So Abraham and Hagar sleep together. She does conceive, and she bears a son named Ishmael. And yet after Hagar gets pregnant, Sarah and Hagar have a major conflict, a huge falling out. Sarah wants to kick her out of the camp because she's causing problems. Hagar thinks it's unfair and should be treated with respect and with honor because of this role that she's played. And it turns into a huge mess for generations. Now, Sarah eventually does end up conceiving because God says, no, I'm going to do this line through your wife. I'm going to make this promise happen because I'm going to make it happen. But there's a split. Hagar has to leave with Ishmael at some point. The family is divided, and then for generations, even up until this day, because Abraham was the father of nations, there's still a split because of that one choice. Now, was it the end of Abraham? No, God was merciful, and we'll see what the redemption looks like in a little bit. But he thought, I'm just going to do it my way rather than God's way. And it had huge implications, not only for his family, but for generations to come. The second story that I want to talk about today is Delilah, from more of the sin side. She was able to seduce Samson away from his calling, and she used his ego to do so. Right? He knew she was beautiful, and she knew she was beautiful, and she used that to her advantage to get the prophet of God away from what he was called to do. So he kept lying to her about what it was from God that gave him his power to take down basically anybody who stood in his way, whether it was a lion, whether it was 100 or 1,000 men. He could just take people out. But it was a woman with seductive powers who took him out. And how she did it was, he was not supposed to cut his hair. And because she had, got to him, he told her eventually, he resisted at first, but then eventually told her what it was that allowed the power of God to come on him and enable him to be so strong. Well, guess what? She went right back and told her buddies, her Philistine buddies, and they came in and cut his hair off, and his power was gone. And then they took him away, they blinded him, they put him in prison. And yet he called for mercy from God. And in his final breath, he took out a whole bunch of Philistines and himself at the same time after being blinded. The strength of God came on him one more time. But she was able to take him away from his calling, and also pretty much end his life, make him go blind, because she used her powers of seduction against him. So those are two stories of sin. And now let's talk about two stories where people are victims in the Bible of sexual sin against them or sexual accusations against them. So the first one we're going to talk about is Joseph in the Old Testament. So this would have been Abraham's great grandson, Joseph. So then it was Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, and one of them was Joseph. He had waited a long time to have Joseph, Joseph was his favorite. His brothers hated him and sold him into slavery, but God's favor was on him, and he ended up one of the highest servants in Potiphar's household. However, Potiphar's wife thought Joseph was pretty fine and wanted to sleep with him. But in this dynamic, she had the power and he had none. So when she tried to seduce him, he actually stood up and was righteous and said no. And she kept trying. And one day she tried and she ended up ripping his clothes as he ran away, because he just was so righteous that he just would not even tolerate it anymore. He just ran away because she was so persistent. However, after that, she basically Me Too'd him, right? Accused him. And some of the Me Too accusations were true, and some of them were false to just get at men. And in this case, this false accusation landed Joseph in prison for a long time. And it wasn't until God raised him out of it through dream interpretation and raised him up over all of Egypt that he was able to kind of find his footing again. But he suffered a long time because of the false accusation of Potiphar's wife. And then the second story with on the other side, the flip side, is with what happened with Tamar. Now, this is not the Tamar that we see in The Chosen. We will talk about her in a second, but it's the Tamar that is one of David's daughters, King David's daughters. And this story is very sad. So essentially, she was one of many siblings. David was a king who had many wives. That also caused him problems, but we won't talk about that here. So one of his wives had given birth to Amnon, and one of his wives had given birth to Absalom and Tamar. So Absalom and Tamar were full-blooded brother and sister, and Amnon was Tamar's half brother. And he ended up starting to be infatuated with his sister, with his half sister. And he got to the point where he was so full of lust that he decided, no matter what, I'm getting my sister. So he pretended to be sick, and when she came in to take care of him, he raped her. And this is one of the most sad verses in the Bible of what happens with her. It says, so Tamar lived as a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house, which the Bible speaks of our humanity, and rape causing women to be desolate is very true. It can cause PTSD, it can cause addiction, it can cause depression, so many things. And you see that with Tamar. You also see what happens when there's repercussions, right? It doesn't just affect the woman, it affects everybody around her. So Absalom is so angry, and he goes to the king, and the king doesn't respond in the way that Absalom thinks he should. And so eventually Amnon is killed by Absalom. And then Absalom eventually tries a coup against David, because now he's just furious with his father for how he treated the situation. And Absalom ends up dying as well in the coup. So it becomes this huge mess. And you can just see that this sin against her had these huge ripple effects. So those are kind of two ways that we see it in the Bible. And what I so appreciated about season 1 of The Chosen was how they wove redemption arcs in for these, particularly the female victims. They haven't really gone into depth with anyone who's sinned sexually on the guy side, or is a victim on the guy side, but you see it with 2 women and possibly a third in The Chosen. So you see it with Mary and Magdalene. Mary Magdalene had been a victim of rape at some point, and you see that she had become addicted to alcohol. You see that she was depressed. Oh, she was even possessed. And, she was just in a really bad state of mind, to the point where she wanted to end it all. And she's not the only woman who's been raped who wants to end it all. And at the moment that she's about to, you remember that scene, the dove flies, she ends up back at the bar, and it's Jesus who says, that's not for you. And then he lays his hands on her and delivers her of her demons and delivers her of her pain. And then also at the end of the season, so you have it at the bookends, right? You have Mary at the beginning, and then you have the woman at the well, Photina, at the end. Photina was more, you could probably call her a man eater. In the Bible, it said that she'd been married 5 times and she was living with somebody who was not her husband. But Jesus, both in the Bible and more in The Chosen, they expanded a little bit, recognizes that she was also in pain, bouncing from man to man because of the pain. And of all addictions, including sexual addiction, that's often the case. Like, you're looking for something to soothe the pain, self-medication, right? So, what does it look like when Jesus redeems this? So, if you've suffered from any kind of sexual abuse or sexual sin, I want you to rewatch that ending scene from episode one, season one, where Jesus lays his hands on Mary. And I just want you to put yourself in her case, right? To let Jesus, to imagine Jesus just touching your head and saying, like, be free from this. Like, I set you free from this, and just kind of breathe it in and take it. Because as someone who's gone through that journey, I know that Jesus has the power to free you from anything, from the suicidal thoughts to the PTSD. It may be a journey, it may take time, you may need help along the way. There's no shame in that, because there's the Lord has hands and feet all over the world. Or maybe you do feel shame because you have sinned and you think that there's no way out. Well, that's not true, because we see all over the Bible that God not only has a redemption story for the individual, right? In Abraham's case, he never took away the blessing, even though he sinned. And he still had a son of promise that made him the father of nations and still makes him honored among many, many people in the earth today. And God looked ahead and said, my Messiah is coming through you, Abraham. And in Mary's case, that was clear redemption. Mary Magdalene's case, that was clear redemption, that Jesus pulled her up out of the pit. And in the woman at the well's case, it was clear redemption too, that her story has touched so many people throughout time, that this woman who just couldn't get it right was seen by God. I'm curious about what your story of redemption is, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be sexual, but if it is, those stories are powerful because so many men and women suffer in silence. You can find my story in here, but what's a redemption story where either you were the victim in a crime, sexual or otherwise, and God redeemed it anyway. God took what was meant for evil and he made it good, or he took something that you did wrong and redeemed it within your story, within the stories of others. These are what makes God's grace so powerful, is that whether we are the ones who trespassed or the ones that we are trespassed against, he offers forgiveness and he offers freedom and healing. So that's my take on The Chosen and Sex in the Bible, part 2, taking a look at what happens when sex goes bad. I appreciate you journeying with me, and I look forward to talking with you soon. Please take a moment to share this video, like and subscribe, trying to grow my audience, and I welcome you to the Alyssa's Movie Takes team.